I carried in my body, like a lot of shame, but a shame that really felt beyond physical,
Yeah.
because I started so young. And when I sat down to write, I said, well, I'll probably write about 50% of this stuff. There's about 50% of this stuff over here that I just really have to hold back. I can't share it with the world. I don't even know that they could stomach it.
Mm.
Literally, a person that grows up in the projects and the pressure of those poverty in the Bronx, or a person that grows up in a billionaire household where the mother is a psychological tyrant, and a
Yeah.
person coming back from Afghanistan can have the exact same biological injury with the exact same symptoms. Post-traumatic stress is a broken leg. More about the brain in the last 10 years
Yeah.
and the nervous system than we did in the previous 10,000. You don't have to live constantly in a state of your body and your nervous system buzzing about what's going to happen. You don't have to live like
Absolutely.
that.
Today, I'm introducing a new guest to the Live, Love, Learn podcast, Jamie Mustard. Now, Jamie is a conceptual artist, artistic director, and author. He was born into the Scientology movement, and his story of poverty, extreme abuse from birth, and escaping the slave system he found himself in led to his healing journey, which is an inspiration for us all. In my opinion, it provides the missing link to understanding the aspects of human behaviour that we're all now seeing disrupting all areas of society, from political leaders to all of our lives. In Jamie's forthcoming book, ChildX, he shows us the aspects of the hidden generation of children born into Scientology. It will send chills down your spine. But the good news is his trauma led Jamie to working with top medical and trauma professionals who have discovered an incredible breakthrough in brain and nervous system science. This recognises that post-traumatic stress disorder is indeed a biological injury, not a mental disorder. This is a key difference that will impact millions of lives. Jamie discusses this and the amazing successful cure for this post-traumatic stress injury in his book, The Invisible Machine, showing that the victim's nervous system could be reset biologically with incredible results. Jamie's upcoming book, ChildX, is a must-read for us all, for anyone who's struggling to understand why the world is as it is, and his book, The Invisible Machine, provides hope, understanding and solutions to us all, as every single one of us I know can either recognise the post-traumatic stress injury signs in ourselves or loved ones. So please sit back and enjoy this episode with Jamie. Right, so excited to have Jamie Mustard with us today, conceptual artist, artistic director and writer. And Jamie's story is quite incredible. We're going to cover so much in this interview today. Really from his personal story, being born into the movement of Scientology and the huge lessons that he's learned through that, which are told so eloquently in his upcoming book, ChildX. So Jamie, such a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. It's raining here, so
Same here.
yeah. So you're giving me gave me a reason to get up a little earlier and something to look forward to. All right. But no, I'm doing well. I'm kind of relieved to be um, you know, kind of done with the writing and production side of this book, so as so that it can come out later this year. And now I get to do the part where I get to talk to interesting people about important ideas.
It's
And
such an important area. It really
yeah,
is, Jamie. And I think we're going to see as we go through this conversation how it links to so much that's going on, and that your honesty from sharing so much of what you've been through, which can't have been easy, is going to help so many people understand what's going on with themselves and what's going on with society.
I hope so. And that really is the point. I guess my frustration that led to this book, because I was never going to write a book about this, or if I did, I was going to do it when I was very, very old, because I went through a crucible. I mean, a true gauntlet physically and psychologically. And because it started for me as an infant, at birth, I was kind of turned over to this organization, to this movement. Um, I carried in my body, like a lot of shame, but a shame that really felt beyond physical,
Yeah.
because I started so young. And when I sat down to write, I said, well, I'll probably write about 50% of this stuff. There's about 50% of this stuff over here that I just really have to hold back. I can't share it with the world. I don't even know that they could stomach it.
Mm.
But you get into that process and you start to think about what's important. And I, you know, left it all on the table, let's say. And yeah, so what drove me is, we've had, probably 55 years, probably since the first one came out around probably in the 70 or something, of books on the subject of this movement, what it's done, memoirs. And only this year did a book come out in Denmark that was about what happened to these lost generations of children. And that was written by an older guy, an older Danish guy that was curious and researched it. So I feel my frustration is that this story has not been told, and and I want to make it to me it should have been the first book. I saw this uh, thing on my Instagram written by a young Jewish woman who is a supporter of Palestine. And I'm not trying to get political, but if you don't mind, just came to my Instagram yesterday.
Mm.
I'd like to read it. Um, I'd like to read it because it really made me think, and it's why I'm here. And I hope I'm not going on and on, but I'd just like to read
No,
this
it's
and then
brilliant.
okay. She said, it says here, I always care about the children killed. The children are never at fault. This is not complicated. Mourn all of the children and do it always. And so my frustration is that it's been 55 years since these books started coming out, and this is really the first time there's been a book about really trying to tell the story of what happened to these lost generations of children. And I feel, Catherine, that it should have been the first book.
Yeah.
And that's what I set out to explore. Why was this not the first book? And so we can start there.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I've got so many questions. But let's go back to the beginning if we can, Jamie, and talk about, if you can, your as much as you're able to share about your family history and how you came to be born into the movement of Scientology.
Well, it's an incredible story. I'm of mixed race, and I mostly was connected to my maternal grandmother and those uh, relatives. She was born and raised in the segregated South under Jim Crow laws. She met my grandfather at a black medical school. And what's really amazing about them is just what my family accomplished between 1865 and 1940, which is right around the time, maybe a little after they left the South after medical school. My grandmother did medical technology masters, and my grandfather was a physician. So what my family accomplished in that 1865 to 1940, 75 years, was a staggering amount of wealth and a history of Black physicians. My great grandfather, who I'm named after, was a physician in this town called Henning, Tennessee, where Alex Haley grew up and was a classmate of my aunt. And he would, do medical care sometimes in trade for goats and chickens, right? So this is a story of Black success that is not really told, not just in terms of the medical lineage, healers, I guess you could say. But in terms of the wealth that they amassed, okay, through and so I was really somebody that was going to be born, should have been born a prince,
Mm.
and I was born a slave. So I think there's a great irony to the story that my grandparents accomplished so much in the shadow of slavery, or right after, and then I was born in, by all intents and definitions, of a slave. The reason the book is called ChildX is because that's what I call myself, or all the kids that I grew up with, or any kid out there whose life is predetermined for them before they're even born. Somebody decides what they're going to do and be before they even have an identity. That's what I refer to as a child X. That's why the name of the book is Child X. And so, when I first started talking to my publisher about possibly writing uh, a book, well, two things came up. First, he said, could you write a book on this? And I said, probably not. And it would be hard. And he said, why? And I said, because nobody wants to see a kitten strangled for 300 pages.
Mm.
And then he looked at me wide-eyed and he said, well, how would you solve that? And then he started asking me about my family and my family history, like you just did. And it's not something I talk about a lot, even though I was incredibly close with my maternal grandmother. She shaped my life in a way. She rescued me from illiteracy when I escaped at 19. And I guess, he said, and I was telling him what I just told you. And, he indicated you should be telling the story in relation to your history. And I really didn't like that idea. I don't know why. But 3 days went by and I realized it was the only way to tell it, that I needed a context. And so that was the kind of beginnings of it. I never really had thought until he asked me those questions. He asked me to look at that. Like, and I never thought until he'd asked me that how I was supposed to be born and
Yeah.
what I was supposed to be. And I don't really blame the movement of Hubbard. My mother should have been the first line of defense. I mean,
Were both your parents
y-
Scientologists?
y- uh, well, my father is deceased,
Yeah.
and my mother um, is yes, she is. And she grew up with every opportunity that you could imagine, all the opportunities. And I was taken from the hospital directly to a slum in downtown Los Angeles at birth, in living conditions that you couldn't imagine, that started a crucible of what would be the first part of my life. Um, and except for a kind of 2.5 year break in Oregon that probably saved my life. It gave me a breath. Um, and
How
so
old
it's
were
just,
you then? How old were you when you had that break?
12, maybe 12 and a half, something like that. Yeah. So 13, some around in there. And maybe I was 13. And so that gave me a breath that saved my life. But, one of the things that I don't think people understand about us kids, this movement has got tentacles all over the world, right? And you can grow up in a wealthy family that goes and is a parishioner, if you want. I mean, that's a big. I don't know if I'm going to call it a religion, but they do the courses and counseling that's
Yeah.
offered, and or you can grow up in the belly of the inner navy, which is the inner core that runs it, which walks around Sydney, Australia, or Central Florida, or Mexico, or Copenhagen, Denmark, or urban Los Angeles in naval uniforms, right? And it's a militaristic structure. So the thing that I think people don't, one of the stories that I don't think is really truly been told is the level of poverty and
Yeah.
neglect that we grew up in, like a really, really extreme level of poverty that would be worse than the kind of worst housing project in the Bronx. I mean, a really deep poverty. No bed sheets, congealed oil mattresses, not learning to brush your teeth, right? I mean, and so uh, no air conditioning, bunk stack 3 high dormitories, not enough caregivers, and an environment of complete. And then you're under this structure, but you're also in inner city Los Angeles.
Mm.
And you're dealing with the things that exist in inner city Los Angeles, right? So it's kind of there's a chapter in the book called "In the Belly of Two Beasts," right? So I don't think that is understood. So I really wanted to, for the first time, explain what this does to children that grow up in the inner Navy like me. That, I mean, again, I was an infant. Children enter it at all different ages if their parents go into it. And then also, what would it mean? There's a lot of suicides and deaths of children that grew up in normal affluent families that were subject to the principles of this thing. And one of the principles of this thing, whether you grew up in the poverty and deprivation and just brutality that I grew up in, or you grow up, say, in a wealthy family,
Mm-hmm.
is there's this concept that you're not a child,
Yeah.
that we're all kind of fallen gods. We're trillion-year-old fallen gods, that they're being imprisoned in flesh bodies that are um, uh, and that the whole point of this movement of Hubbard's work is to get us to go through these steps that will get us out of the flesh body and back to our godlike state. So you're not treated like a child. At 4 years old, you're expected to know and operate like an adult.
It's horrific. I mean, that in itself is horrific. With the poverty, because certainly until I heard your story, I wasn't aware of it at all. And what do you think the point of that is? Why were children kept like that? And when you were going through it, because you were born into that, well, you were placed there from birth, how aware were you of what you
And
were
that,
going through at the time?
and I want people to really understand that that's a real thing. I'm not, embellishing that.
Yeah.
There's zero baby pictures of me. There was maybe one at one point that my grandmother took on a trip to LA. There was a single Polaroid. There's no baby pictures. And
Mm,
there's no baby pictures because there was no one around to take them.
mm,
And the conditions in that place in Los Angeles are extraordinary. But I think, I want people to have a reason to read the book. You know what I mean? But I think I've done a lot of contemplating on that. And, it a little bit breaks my heart when you say that. And it's kind of why we're here. When you say you have no idea of the poverty, that kind of, it's incredible to me when people have been writing books about this for 50 years. I know that there's been a few books. There's a woman named Catherine Spallino. She wrote a book called The Bad Cadet. And I know she talks about it. So it's not been totally unmentioned. I know Leah mentions aspects of it in her book, Leah Remini. But I think that this first generation of children that were growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was worse. It was like, and my reasoning for it is just a kind of form of neglect and how they kind of saw us. Okay. Everything about in this movement in Hubbard's world is about production, right? Working, getting things done, what he would call products. Okay. And we were seen as kind of a distraction from our parents being able to work. But he also saw us, unlike the new leader, but he also saw us as potential and important labor in the future.
mhm.
So if you were to ask, and again, this is my opinion, right? If I were to look at it across multiple geographies, England, I mean, I was stationed in England as a teenager at the compound is it Southern England that's below
Yeah, East
Gatwick?
Grinstead. Yeah, not far
Yeah,
from
yeah.
me. Yeah.
I was stationed there as a teenager where Neil Gaiman grew up, right? Um, I would say that I think that the poverty, the conditions there for the children were equal, and I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same in Australia, and
Mm,
I know it was the same in Copenhagen. And so my view is that what is the minimum amount since everything is in your mind and there's no, I've just written, I had a book come out 2 years ago on the biology of trauma, but
Yep.
that's not what Hubbard believed. Hubbard believes that everything is created by your mind, everything. Okay. And so my belief is what is the minimum amount we can do to spend to keep these kids penned up and off to the side while we grow them so that they can be labor in the future. So I would say we were being penned and grown almost as a metaphor symbolically like embryos, gestating till we were big enough that they could pull us out and put us to work. And
When you
so,
say that, sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but when you
yeah,
say
no,
that, it really reminds me of how a lot of humans treat factory animals now.
I would say that if someone had to describe the first, 10 year, 9, 10 years of my life, especially the first 7 years of my life, but I would say 9 to 10. I would say an animalization
Mm.
of is the only way I could describe it. It was an animalization. Um, I was telling a well-known psychiatrist about it one time. I wasn't giving him the details of the movement because it was before I was ready. I was still, I was living a life of trying to forget it ever happened, not look back, and not ever share it with people because I was embarrassed and ashamed and I was traumatized. But I
Mm.
was telling a psychiatrist about it, a famous psychiatrist named Frank Ochberg, who had defined Stockholm syndrome for the FBI in the 1970s. And he is the man that in 2012, with another doctor, coined the term post-traumatic stress injury
Yep.
rather than disorder. And he looked at me when I was telling him the physical living conditions, and he said, Jamie, you were raised by wolves.
Mm.
And
I think wolves would have done a much better job, actually, in all
so yeah,
seriousness.
so I really do think that Hubbard saw us as useful potential labor in the future. And so what's the minimum amount of staff and the minimum living conditions that we can how can we stack as many of these kids together and literally just grow them until they can work for us. And then you don't go to school. So you learn to read young because you have to study the doctrine. But at 20 years old, I couldn't write. I didn't know how to use a comma at 20.
Mm.
Okay. And then I ended up, getting a degree from one of your, lauded institutions in
Mm.
England. But that was a very unlikely story. I don't really believe it was a meritocratic story. I believe there's a lot of angels and things that conspired the universe to give me an opportunity. And then I think that I was desperate enough to take it. A lot of the times my grandmother, she would, when I got into the London School of Economics, she turned, just 2 years. I mean, I was totally illiterate. I could not write.
Wow.
At 20, at 19, I couldn't write a paragraph.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to use periods and I could read though, right? And she said when I got in, just 2.5 years later, when I got in to that school, she looked at me. I'll never forget it in her foyer in her um, house outside of New York City in the suburbs of New York City, and she in Westchester County, and she said, "How are you doing this?" And I said, I don't know. But what I was thinking was, I'm fucking desperate.
Yeah. It's
Right. Right. So I think desperation combined with the, benevolent forces, uh, con, you know, com conspiring in the universe to give me an opportunity, and I was desperate enough to take it.
yeah.
But a lot of the kids, when they come out, they didn't have a place to necessarily go or land. They
No,
don't
I mean, that's
have,
one of the things I wanted to ask about. I mean, you've got siblings, yes?
yeah.
And where do you sit with your siblings age-wise? You middle, oldest, youngest?
Well, you have to understand also to put this thing into context. This was, and I talk about this in the book, is you also have to look at the time, right? These people coming out of the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis and these assassinations of JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Vietnam War. Okay, this was a crucible of psychological pressure that was put on
Yeah.
these kids while they were growing up. So it's not surprising that in the 60s and 70s, they just went F it, So, there was a lot of these groups, thousands of them, the Children of God, Jim Jones, some of them worse than others, right? So I don't have a monopoly on human misery or what happened to me. I think that some of the stuff that happened in the Children of God, where they were systemically molested
Yeah.
as a policy, right? Um, you could say that is worse, right? What I think is different about my situation and the kids that grow up in the inner Navy or even outside of it is, there's a kid, there's a woman I know whose brother was a child genius. She grew up in a wealthy family outside of the inner core, and he went to MIT at 16. And I believe it was on Hubbard's birthday that he jumped out a window to his death. And he grew up in a very wealthy family, or very affluent family. I don't want to say very wealthy, and was a child genius and killed himself jumping out a building on the MIT campus. So I think the question you have to ask yourself is what makes this experience unique is the psychological indoctrination.
Yeah.
For me, it was a psychological indoctrination and captivity. For that other kid, there was probably a form of mental captivity. So I think one of the questions we really need to examine is what is it that, what is the indoctrination that's happening to these children young that really does make it different than anything else? I would say that Hubbard probably created the most extensive and effective mind control system in the human species. And so that's unique. Okay.
Well, I was
And
going to say, I did want to bring into that because,
yeah,
most of our listeners have heard about the MK Ultra program, and we've spoken to Kathy O'Brien a lot of times. And I think this psychological abuse, physical abuse, all sorts of, sexual abuse of young children can compartmentalize the mind. And even the Jesuits say, give me a boy until they're 7 and I'll give you the man. So do you think that there was a darker agenda here to actually make sure that anyone who grew up in that system was completely controllable?
wow. Okay. That's such a good question. And no one's ever asked me that before. And I don't think that I would write it like I talk about it per se the way you asked it in the book. So it's such an important question. And I would answer it this way. I think Hubbard believed what he was doing.
Yeah.
But like you could compare it to communism, fascist communism compared to anything else. Do they believe it? They say they believe it. They probably believe it, but they're also, when you're at the top of these bureaucracies, you're eating, gefilte, whitefish and caviar, and you're living a privileged life in a hedonistic life,
Mm.
right? So I think that he thought that he had come up with these answers. He'd convinced himself. I'm sure he had moments of doubt, and he was aware that the guy had been a hypnotist. I
Yeah.
think, there's a lot of stuff that he wrote about MK Ultra type programming. He talked a lot about what he called, how intelligence agencies around the world uh, used a technique called PDHing. This is a Hubbard acronym for pain drug hypnosis.
Wow.
So this is something that he was highly aware of and had studied deeply because he wrote about it, right? So I think that he thought, okay, I have the answers to the universe, but people aren't going to always do what I want. So if we're going to save the universe, we're going to have these methods of controlling these people, even if they're unaware of it at times, because it's for the greater good. There's a lot of this talk in this movement of so you can, like in Spock, you
Yeah.
sacrifice the one for the will of the many. This is a huge concept in this movement. So that is my thought, is that he thought I have to be able to control some people. So he created all these kind of Orwellian thought stopping pieces of indoctrination, so that if you started to look at what was happening around you, you had this piece, and I could give you a specific example, but you had this piece of indoctrination that would just stop your thinking. But I really just think one of the things that needs to be examined about these children, I'll say this last bit and then we can go wherever you want to go, is that you're also, when you're a child, and this would, being overly emotional is frowned upon. And in my case, it was, could be punished.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you were 4 years old and we played to this open air, this open to the sun, degrading kind of rotting parking lot with, concrete and sometimes metal sticking out of the ground, and say you fell and you hurt yourself. Well, what they would call a nanny, one of your caretakers who would run over, and they might say something to you like, stop dramatizing. In other words, you're faking it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would say to you the two terms that I didn't even understand when I was a kid, but I got the gist that I needed to shut up. One is, quote, stop or knock off the HENR, which I came to learn when I was older. I mean, I would just shut up out of fear, but I came to learn when I was a little bit older that it meant stop, and this is a Hubbard term, the human emotion and reaction. Stop the emotion.
Oh.
Okay. The other thing, and this would happen even outside an inner Navy kid to an inner Navy kid. This could happen in a wealthy family. This could happen anywhere in this movement. And then the next thing they might say is knock off the bank. What would occur in my 4-year-old mind, I probably understood this by the time I was 6 or 7, was do they want me to rob a bank?
Yeah.
But what that means is Hubbard called the reactionary mind, what Freud called the subconscious mind, the bank. It's where you store all your negative emotions and thoughts and bad
Yeah.
things that happen to you. It's the part of your mind that's below your consciousness. So this idea that you would be upset is not because you just hurt yourself. It's because you're manifesting something from a past life or an earlier part of your life.
Oh my God.
So you're getting this indoctrination in this is the way you're going to look at the world. You're not going to be emotional. You're going to, you're an adult. You can handle anything, and you're getting this as a toddler. And I often wonder about what the psychological effects on a child that would be. It's a unique thing to there. It's a unique form of psychic control. And the other thing that you're taught to believe, even as young as 4, is that if anything bad happens to you, you pulled it in. This
Yeah.
is a Hubbard term. You pulled it in.
That's
So
so
you
abusive.
trip and you hurt yourself, then they're not looking at you like, oh my God, let me have some empathy for this child that just hurt themselves. They're walking up to you and said, you just did something bad if that happened. What did you do to pull that in? And if you were born with, I met a guy that was born with some congenital physical conditions that was in the inner Navy, Hubbard's inner Navy, and he was made to believe that he had done something in a past life to be born with his physical deformities. So you did this. You did this to yourself. So you learned very young to hide your pain.
Yep.
Because manifesting anger, manifesting some sort of upset with saving the world or how you're being treated is punishable, seriously punishable by labor, by isolation, by psychic brutality. And I wonder what that effect of teaching a child, they're not to be emotional, and also every bad thing that happens to them, they're causing when they're not even in a place where they can do bad things. They're captive, right? What is that doing to the child mind? What is that doing to the physical development of the brain? What is that doing to the physical development of the body? A lot of the kids that I grew up with, when I see them on Facebook and so forth, they have fibromyalgia
Yeah.
or other autonomic disease, autonomic conditions.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it's a staggering amount of stress. And yeah, so I hope that answers your
So
question.
many ways I want to go with this, and I want to
Yeah.
come back to some of the actual living instructions. But what you said there was just so profound, and a couple of things it reminded me of. First and foremost, in the wild, where you've got the prey animal and the predator animal relationship, it's very well known that the prey animals If they're lame or something, they have to hide the pain, because if not, they're going to be the first one that the predator goes for. So this leads on to so much of your other work in terms of the body holds a score and the post-traumatic injury, not disorder, that we can come on to. But one of the things that you said then that was so profound, Jamie, that made me think is, with what you've seen growing up in these conditions, it must give you such an insight to what you see going on in society now, because you talked about the control and about how people, these leaders like Hubbard, they believe their own story, they believe their own mission. And when you look at a lot of political leaders now, you know, people assume that they're just being deliberately evil. But if they really believe what they're doing, and then they need to control the masses to get their version of what they want to accomplish put in place, the trauma that you experienced as a child, which was so extreme, do you see parallels with the traumas that are out in everyday society? Okay, not as extreme to yours, but being used as a control mechanism.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, let me say this before I answer. Okay. ChildX, my book ChildX, which is the first story that I believe truly tells, it's not the first story ever told by a child that grows up in it. There's been some really great stuff written, but it is the first book that tells the story what happened to these lost generations of children.
Yeah.
Okay. And I probably didn't even name the worst thing that ever happened. The worst thing that happened is, imagine growing up from birth, barely seeing or without parents,
Mm.
no human touch, no love, no care, right? I had memories from when I was an infant, and it was really wild. You know, about a year ago, maybe a little over, a woman reached out to me. She'd see me on something that had been a 7-year-old caretaker of mine in that institution. She was 7 and I was a baby.
Oh my God.
And she was, I had memories from that, and I have kind of an extraordinary memory in a lot of ways. And she was, confirming things that I remembered, and then making me aware of living conditions and things that were done to me as an infant that I did not remember.
Mm.
Okay. And it was extraordinary to have this woman said, she had not been able to get me out of her head for, 40 years, right?
Wow.
Like I stuck with her from the time she was
Yeah.
7, right? And when she called me, I was like, me or all the kids? She said, no, you. I was assigned to you for the
Wow.
last 40 years. They're, constantly in my life. When I was a teenager, when I was in my 20s, when I was in my 30s, I was constantly asking myself, what happened to Jamie? And until I saw you on, a little over a year ago. And so it was a profound moment for her. And it was a profound moment for me. And one of the reasons it was so profound for me is because just to know that someone cared
Mm.
was important, right? But what did it do to me that I didn't have this human touch? I mean, I think for a
Yeah.
lot of people it would break them permanently, and I'm flawed, and I'm, I have to deal with the scars, and I have to deal with I've done a lot of work on healing, but I don't think, people say, how do you heal from that? I don't know that you ever do. I think it's like an open wound that you're going to have with you on some level for the rest of your life, that you have to watch it. Because the minute I think you think you're healed from something like that, you're going to hurt yourself. You have to
Absolutely.
always be looking for what you don't know, a piece of indoctrination that you can't see, a piece of trauma affecting your emotional decisions, your emotional reactions that you can't see, right? And this is important. So, Child X is really important because I want to make the reason I did it, and I exposed myself because I was trying to be secret and
Yeah.
not be embarrassed and not be public. I want to do my art, and I want to be, want people to understand. I was wanting the world to interpret me through that, right? And I didn't want this thing to define me. But one of the reasons I decided to do it is I really want this story told. Why didn't we protect the children? Why was that not the first book? I answer that in this book. So if what I'm saying resonates with anybody in your audience, I would plead for them to please pre-order the book.
Absolutely.
If you pre-order the book, the publisher will print more copies. and the chance of the book's success and this story getting out after 5 decades, half a century, it will really help this story to get out. Okay. And the question is, why was not protecting the children the first book? And I address that. And I think it's a really important thing, not just for the subject of Hubbard's work or Hubbard's, yeah, but also for the subject of humanity.
I don't think
And
it's ever been more important, Jamie. I mean, we're in such a disarray as humanity in terms of the decisions we're taking. I love Caesar Milan, who says humans are the only species on the planet that follows unstable leaders, apart from
yeah,
lemmings.
so I want to. So now that I said that, and I want to. You finish, but I do want to answer your
Well,
question on
I just think
society.
that it's just the reason I'm so taken with your story. I mean, first and foremost, I rescue a lot of very highly traumatized animals and work a lot with rescues. And where every time I see some of your work and hear you speak, it gives me a deeper level of understanding because a lot of these animals have been separated from, they've never known their mother.
Okay,
They've not
interesting.
been raised with any love. And I've got two dogs from Romania that were separated from their mother. And I think this is very relevant because I've heard you talk about this, Jamie, in other interviews where they're from the same litter, but you wouldn't know because they weren't raised as a litter. They were shoved in a rescue with 100 other adult dogs and left to fend
Okay,
for themselves.
okay.
And one of
Well,
them expresses
yeah.
through fight and one expresses through flight.
Okay. Before I address that, I want to make sure I answered your question because I went off on a tangent to explain. Please, when you're done with this interview, please help me get my story out.
Absolutely.
And you can do it by pre-ordering the book so that we can have a bigger launch later this year. Okay. So the minute you do that, you're making a active effort to release this story after 5 decades of secrecy. Okay. Um, the but to answer your question is I see a lot of parallels, and I want to be very careful here because I try not to be a political
Yeah.
person, and I try not to think politically, and I even try to look at the political leaders that I don't like
Yeah.
as human beings and maybe victims of their own trauma.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Trauma is what creates narcissism.
Absolutely.
So I want to answer it like this. Well, I mean, there's a book out there by the world's leading cult expert called The Cult of Trump by Steve Hassan. Okay. So yeah, do I see parallels between our current political life and how I grew up in terms of the information control and the use of repetitive mind control techniques? 100%. I wrote a book on how to use repetition, imagery, and words to grab attention.
Yeah.
That was my first book, The Iconist. And one of the things I say in that book is Orwell talks about the repetition of words and the repetition of imagery as this kind of inherently negative thing, but it's not an inherently negative thing. It's how human beings take in information. So if you can understand how human beings take in information, you can communicate with them better in a positive way. Repetition of words, repetition of imagery, it's just a tool, like a
Yeah.
car or a TV or a knife. It depends on how you use it. When in elementary school, we teach through large repetitive imagery, repetitive words like Sesame Street, and repetition, and it's completely benevolent. And there's studies that show that babies and adults learn way faster that way. So the first thing you have to understand is this technique in which we are controlling people is not an inherently bad technique. It's more has to do with our primal lizard brain and how we prefer to learn and how we prefer
Yeah.
to take in the world. And I could get into that more. But yes, I see massive parallels right now in the current political climate. And I don't, on both sides. I don't, I don't want to say both sides. That's what he said with but with the white supremacists. But I see it in both political parties. It might be worse in one or the other, but there's, horrible misinformation in the United States about even the way we look at um I don't like either of them.
Oh
Okay,
no,
so
absolutely.
okay, I don't like either of them. I can't so I will say this. The so we look at political leaders and the way they act, and maybe this is a good way to segue into my book on the biology of trauma, which is this book called The
That
Invisible.
is incredible. I'm halfway through it on Audible, and it's a must read for everyone.
Thank you, thank you. But it's called The Startling Truth About Trauma and the Scientific Breakthrough That Can Transform Your Life. So about 7 or 8 years ago, when I decided to start looking at getting actual therapy for the first time in my life, after about 6, 8 weeks in, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I didn't like it. I laughed. I thought it was a joke. Like I just didn't believe in it. I was raised to believe that psychiatrists and psychologists were evil
Yeah,
and the source of all strife in the history of the earth. We're being raised as young kids to believe that psychiatrists were behind the Nazis. Psychiatrists were behind the eugenics of the Jim Crow.
yeah.
Psychiatrists were behind apartheid in South Africa. Like we're really raised to believe this from a young age. Okay. So the idea that the fact that I finally went to get therapy, and I was very disturbed when I came to terms. I remember laughing at this person who had diagnosed me and that's ridiculous. I'm not, I haven't been to war. What are you talking? I mean, I was in total denial. Okay. And she looked at me and just looked and she said, have you been listening to the stories you've been telling me? How could you not? And like in that moment, 40 years of just like bullshit,
Mm.
just completely shattered. She shattered my facade. And the worst thing that you can be in Hubbard's movement, I mean, I even hate calling it Scientology because it's like a fancy word to describe something that's not fancy.
Yeah,
Okay. That's crude and is a punishment system. A lot of it's based on, it's very punishment based and it's
mm.
very judgment based, giving people labels and punishing them. And I can give examples of that. But um, uh, I uh, I would say that. So then I found, so when it came across my desk uh, through my literary agent that there was this new physiological treatment for trauma, a reset of the nervous system. I went, what? I don't have to be crazy? Are you kidding me? So there was a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. J. Faber, Dr. John J. Faber in Los Angeles. He was a fan of my work, The Iconist. He'd become a friend of mine. And even that friendship was weird because I was like, I'm being friends with a psychiatrist, it's
Yeah,
like being friends with the devil. And but when this treatment came across to me, I called him. I said, have you heard of this thing? He said, I haven't. And he is a guy that works every day. He believes that all of mental health is biological.
yeah.
It's a combination of brain health and nervous system, the injury to the nervous system. So he vetted it for me, and that led to me in the middle of COVID, the early days of COVID, getting on a plane to Chicago to get my nervous system reset. And it was the most transformational thing that I've ever done for my life in my life for myself. It changed everything in a matter of 2 days.
And can you explain how they actually do it?
Yeah, and then we'll talk about animals. But I
Yeah,
will say this before we do that, just to finish to tie a bow around the political thing. I don't know if this reset would work on a true NPD narcissist because I wonder if somebody that truly has diagnosable
yeah,
narcissistic personality has a brain development issue. But anything below that,
yeah,
okay, which is most people, um, you know, so many of our political leaders when we see them making bad decisions,
yeah,
it's not necessarily because they're a narcissist.
yeah.
I believe it's because they have this particular biological injury to their body, which is a nervous system that gets stuck in fight or flight.
Hmm.
So, and that if you could do this on, you know, Putin, I mean, you might argue that he's narcissistic, but I don't know these guys, and I get the information that I get as an American is very propagandized. Okay.
Completely.
And
Yeah,
I should say that I've done work teaching special forces. I got invited to Fort Bragg to teach special forces about art and communication, where I actually even did a separate workshop and lecture for special forces psychological operations. 175 psychological operations soldiers and special operations forces on the subject. One of the things we talked about was, counter propaganda against the Russians and the Chinese,
yeah,
right? So, and I didn't want to do it, because I didn't, I'm a pacifist. I didn't even want to work for the it was a process of me coming to work for these guys. But, one of the things that this female colonel that I met before that lecture said to me was, listen, this is the world, how the world works, kid.
Yeah.
If we don't create this counter propaganda, the world falls apart because that means their propaganda wins. We need your help, right? So, explain to us your techniques. Maybe we'll use them, maybe we won't, but um, it's necessary, right? So I would say that a lot of world leaders that we see making completely irrational decisions probably have this psychological injury. And what this psychological injury does is it locks you in fight or it locks you in flight. So, you want me to tell you how it works?
Yes,
I'll tell you
please.
what the injury, or how the injury works, and then you can, after that, ask. We could talk about how the we could talk about how the reset is done. Okay,
Yeah.
but basically, and it's really interesting because it ties again into the childhood thing and the litter question you just asked. Two things cause this biological. If you have trauma and you have the symptoms of trauma, you 100% have a biological injury. You are not crazy. There's nothing wrong in this amorphous mental part of you. You have a combination of damage to your nervous system, and you can see it on a brain scan, or
Yeah.
damage to your brain, and you can see it. We can now see this on a brain scan. And there's simple things that can be done to remediate the brain and to remediate the nervous system so that you can be returned to yourself without these drugs that just mask the problem, or having to do yoga every day, or do all these different forms of meditations where you're just fighting it all the time. Yoga, meditation, these things are amazing. But wouldn't it be great to do those in a solar way where you're not doing it to fight your body?
I
Where you could
love
do
it.
it.
I absolutely love it. I love the way that you described, which would be useful for you to do
Okay.
today, Jamie, about the
Okay.
hardware
So,
and the software.
okay, good. So I'll do that now. And
Yeah.
basically, what causes this biological change in the body is two things. One is a very, very severe blunt force trauma, as in war or sexual assault. Like, say we're
Yeah.
driving down the street or we're driving in the freeway, we swerve our car, we almost crash, but we don't. And if we had crashed, it would have been the worst 50-car pileup with dead bodies. But we don't crash and we're fine. It's just a little skid and we're back on it. We get elevated. Well,
Yeah.
we're designed to come back down, 4 or 5 hours later, and we feel good again. Well, here's what happens. If you get too elevated, as in war or sexual assault, your buddy's head gets blown off in front of you. Here's a sexual assault. You can get so elevated that a biological change occurs in your body.
Yeah.
Okay. Your brain starts secreting what's called NGF, nerve growth factor, and norepinephrine. People with post-traumatic stress have 20% more norepinephrine in the brain. I'm not a scientist, I'm an artist. Uh, the and then your nervous system starts um, secreting this nerve growth factor. Okay. Your nervous system is here in your neck on each side.
Yeah.
And that's where, when you feel anxiety, if you stop and notice where it's coming from, it comes from here. And it's talking to your amygdala. So what's happening is the NGF stays stuck on.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happens. And two things can cause it: blunt force trauma or prolonged allostatic load, toxic stress. You can get this injury from having a distant father or a distant mother, or just a mother that put you down all the time. And this system is apathetic, as the special forces colonel I work with named Paul Tulin says. It doesn't think. So literally, a person that grows up in the projects and the pressure of those poverty in the Bronx, or a person that grows up in a billionaire household where the mother is a psychological tyrant, and a person coming back from Afghanistan can have the exact same biological injury with the exact same symptoms: anxiety, high anxiety, hair trigger reactivity, lack of sleep. You can't sleep if the tiger's chasing you. All of these are symptoms of what you'd experience if you were being chased by a tiger. And when you're being chased by a tiger, that's supposed to last about 30 seconds, where you're either supposed to get away from the tiger, kill the tiger, or get eaten. Our bodies are not physiologically designed to be running from the tiger internally, and all the different things that turn on, from adrenaline to cortisol, that discombobulate the immune system. we're not designed to live like that for more than about 90 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay. So when this system gets stuck on, it's dangerous. But what's happening biologically in the brain, and this, when you have post-traumatic stress is a broken leg you can't see, hence the name of the book, The Invisible Machine. But what happens is if we scan somebody with an MRI that has post-traumatic stress, if I scanned your brain, I would see overactivity in the amygdala.
Yeah.
Okay. And that will go up and down and has some form of regulation, but it will be chronic. Now, if I did this treatment on you over 2 days and I still scanned you every day for a month, you would find that from resetting this nervous system in your neck that talks to your amygdala, that if we do this MRI over a month, that goes way, way down.
Wow.
Okay. And so what's happening physiologically? Well, the way this was discovered was this doctor 25 years ago was doing research on women going through menopause and taking a shot that was developed in 1925 for tingling hands. He was moving it around. He was innovating it, moving it around. There, this chain where the nervous system lives that goes from amygdala, I believe it goes to your toes, is called the stellate ganglion. So he was moving it around different parts of the stellate ganglion, and some of these. This guy is a highly advanced anesthesiologist, the guy that I wrote the book with, the guy that discovered this thing. And these women came to him and said, my post-traumatic stress went away. And he heard it a few times. So then he went on a research. He's a scientist. And he went on a deep dive research and quickly developed this reset, which has been used by the US military for over 20 years. Obama endorsed it back in 2008. US Congress, he's been before Congress. He's done grand rounds at Walter Reed as well as WOMAC, the most advanced military hospital in the world. I would imagine the military all over the world is doing at least 20,000 of these a year. And one of the things that, so back to the tiger thing. So say I'm in Peru and it's 2,000 years ago, and I'm in my loincloth and I go over to the river and I've got a little, bowl made of, some sort of shell or, tree melon or,
Yes.
whatever, giant tree seed. And I'm drinking water and a leopard or a puma comes out of nowhere and attacks me, and we're in this furious fight, and I really believe I'm about to die over elevation, like a sexual assault or whatever, or a war, and it takes my toe, but all of a sudden, I stick a rock in its mouth and I bash its teeth, and it decides I'm too much trouble, and I survive. But it's over elevation. I'm really
Yeah.
was supposed to die. Well, what happens is this NGF turns on in the brain and the nervous system, and it gets stuck on.
Yeah.
And we have nerves that are our nervous system. It's called the system, okay? Here, and we have these nerves in our amygdala that talk to each other, okay? That way, trauma, no one has to touch you.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
remarkable, right?
Yeah.
So it gets stuck on. So what happens is the nerves that cause you to feel like you're in fight or flight, they sprout extra receptors. So where you had 4, now you have 8. Where you have 8, now you have 16. We have 16, now you have 32 receptors. And what that does in practicality is it locks you into flight or flight.
Yeah.
24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. So all of a sudden you're trying to watch a show on Netflix and you can never quite calm down, and you just don't know why, right? Now, the nature is and animals are a massive mitigator of the nervous system. So the thing that would help us mitigate against this injury that would actually keep us alive in a tiger-infested jungle. So it's a good thing if you're in a jungle infested with tigers, but there is a natural counterpart that nature created, which is nature and animals calm the nervous system.
Yeah.
So that's now gone. We're all living in these synthetic environments. Okay. So that natural mitigator isn't there. So we're just, right? We all can notice the minute we go out to someplace that's truly natural, we're really away from the city, we calm right down.
And but we're bombarded by all these radio waves.
Oh yeah, of course,
and everything else. So it's just
but also
layered. Yeah.
But also we how do I want to say it? When we get around animals,
Yeah.
we get really present. Okay, so these are natural mitigators that have now been removed for a lot of us. Or, if we have a dog, it's not the same as being surrounded by animals in nature. Okay,
Yeah.
or cat. So, um, what's happening uh, is like I'll give an animal example. So every once in a while, like at a reading or something, somebody will get up and say, I'm a PhD and I have this and that, and how do you know? And they'll question me in a big crowd.
Yeah.
And I say, like, and what I say is, listen, this is easily observable. Okay. And this is not new science. It was a book that came out in 1970 called The Violence and Struggle for Existence, written by a bunch of Stanford scientists, including Frank Ochberg. It came out 2 years after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So it came out in 70. Coretta Scott King did the introduction to that book. And there's a chapter in that book called Biology and Aggression.
Hmm.
And in that book, these scientists are saying, Frank Ochberg is saying, we 100% know that trauma is a biological injury. And
Yeah.
here's how we know. If you take a dog, a cat, a zebra, a goat, an elephant, a horse, any animal,
Hmm.
and you were to spend a day, just a full day or a week torturing it, like it was in a CIA black site or something, right?
Yeah.
Like truly torturing it. And then we take that animal out, the torture, and we decide that we're going to put it up at the Ritz-Carlton for the rest of its life. Okay. So it's the most pampered animal in history.
Hmm.
That animal is never going to be the same.
Oh, I can vouch
It's,
for that. Yeah.
yeah, it's going to be highly aggressive,
Yeah.
fight, or it's going to be very timid,
Yeah.
flight. Now, we didn't just give that animal a disorder. We
Mm.
changed its biology. And that was a book that came out in 1970. So scientists have known this for a long time. But with Dr. Lipov's work, we now know where that mechanism is. And by using an ultrasound and basically turning off the nerves for 10 minutes using the same $5 amount of medication that goes into an epidural,
Mm.
either bupivacaine or nopivacaine, we can it turns off the nervous system. And then when it turns on, 10 minutes later, it turns on at baseline.
Literally resetting it.
Yeah, and it does all these incredible things to your brain. The other thing is it does, like, you can have someone do this over 2 days and you'll see increased blood flow on that MRI. You'll instantly see increased blood flow to their frontal cortex.
Yeah.
So when you're stuck in fight or flight, it actually constricts the blood flow to your frontal cortex, which is your executive function, right? So when I started working with the military, when I got that invited to work with the military, the colonels saw me asking all these post-traumatic stress questions because I was in the healing stage of my life, and they were like, "Well, you're coming as our guest. Speak to us. Why don't you stay an extra week, and we'll teach you about post-traumatic stress. Be our guest. Let us show you what that means here." And they were doing this treatment, but they were doing it off of a 10-year-old paper the wrong way,
Yeah.
and they uh, weren't really understanding what they were doing, right?
Yeah.
So I went, gosh, the world doesn't even know about this. Right around that time, a private equity firm started opening up clinics to deliver this to regular people all over the United States and Australia. And so I thought somebody needs to bring this to the living room. I know I have somebody that's the child of a billionaire that grew up under tremendous psychological stress that I got to go do this treatment, right? Who had all the symptoms. So the symptoms are what you'd be experiencing if you were running from a tiger.
Mm.
So you'd be anxious, you would have a hair trigger, you'd be reactive, you would not be able to sleep. You can't sleep if a tiger's chasing you.
Yeah.
Okay, 25% of these kids that come back from Afghanistan have ED. You
Yeah.
can't have sex if you're running from a tiger. Mild paranoia, sense of doom.
Yeah.
Everyone listening to this, a huge point, probably 60% of the people, maybe more of this audience, maybe 80% of this audience is going, "Oh my God, he's naming all my
Yeah.
symptoms." Because you have a
Absolutely.
physical injury. And then here's the part where it gets insane. Okay. In the neighborhoods where I grew up, life is cheap, violence is almost acceptable. So the ultimate form of fight is physical violence or
Yeah.
homicide. In the military, where people are trained to protect, the ultimate form of flight is suicidal, or I want
Yeah.
to be careful what we say. We'll say unaliving yourself ideation. Okay. So with what I've seen in my work with the military, I've worked with Rwandan genocide survivors, I've worked with human trafficking survivors, every kind of trauma you could imagine, to somebody that was just had a brutal mother that put them down and had this really, really bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so, and I'm going to bring this back to world leaders. So, uh, I uh, believe so. I 100% believe that ideation, unaliving ideation, is 100% a biological injury. I don't think there's ever been a person. It's an opinion. I'm not a doctor, but
Mm.
I've treated a lot of people in a lot of different forms of trauma, first responders, on and on and on and on. And I've never seen someone uh, get it the right way and not have that reduce, go to a point where it's pretty much gone.
It's
And
incredible. I mean, the
yeah,
impact of this on society, on everything that's wrong with society at all levels, is
I believe that.
enormous. Yeah.
I believe that I went into a jail in the American South, a massive jail that was almost the size of a prison, to interview murderers to find out if a guy that committed an impulse murder in the inner city 30 years ago has the exact same biological symptoms as somebody coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And
Wow.
did they overreact and commit that crime because their biology was lying to them? So take this scenario, because what you said is just so profound and spot on, Catherine. Okay. Take this scenario. Say I'm uh, uh, a black kid and grew up in, this really poor part of Knoxville that was kind of had gangs. And I'm driving around, I'm driving around the city, gathering school supplies, and I'm
Yeah.
17. Okay. Well, I have this injury because I grew up with some sort of kind of gang inner city poverty because of my neighborhood. And say I'm a white cop.
Mm.
Okay. And I am a first responder and I've been doing it for 10, 15 years. So I've been looking at death and wondering, and sometimes a colleague will get killed just by pulling someone over. So I'm carrying they're carrying the same thing, what's called
Yeah.
prolonged allostatic load, which means prolonged toxic stress. Well, here's the thing that's amazing. That causes the exact same change in the body as the tiger incident, the sexual assault, or somebody shooting you. It causes the NGF to get stuck on and the receptors to grow. And the body's apathetic. It's interpreting these things all the same. It doesn't
Yeah.
think. Okay. So that cop walks up to the window, and what's a simple traffic stop for the kid is life or death because his fight or flight system is telling this cop could kill me when it's just a traffic stop. Right. And the cop is looking at this black kid and saying, well, I've seen so many of my buddies get killed around the country this way. Is this the guy that's going to kill me? And his amygdala says, this black kid can kill me. And he's an honor student about to go to college. He just grew up poor. And then one of them is going to the morgue and one of them is going to the jail for the rest of their life. And all because of biology.
Yeah.
So to answer, so if what you were getting at earlier, do I believe that so many of these world leaders are making decisions because they're stuck in fight and they're seeing and reacting based on their biology lying to them? Yes, I do. And it has massive implications for criminal justice in the Western world, especially in countries like the UK and and the United States, where intent
Yeah.
is a huge part of criminal justice. Like if we know that our biology is telling us that a threat is not a threat, when a non-threat is a threat, did we really intend to commit that crime? We need to study this. We need to understand this mechanism because I was one time on a architecture tour of Chicago. I was there working where the doctor lives that invented this treatment. I was there working. I was with a buddy of mine who was getting the treatment, guy that I've known for many years. And, some woman came up to us on the boat and we were in the Lake Michigan looking over the city. And she said, what do you do? And I started telling her about this mechanism. And this woman who was a middle class, CEO of a company of like a family business and in Virginia burst out in tears and started crying. And I said, what's going on? And she said, my brother was murdered by his best friend. And he had cheated on him. he had cheated on it. He had slept with his girlfriend. He found out, and in an instant, his best friend stabbed him in the neck, and he bled out. I don't even think he intended to kill him. The guy's in jail, and I said, I'm so sorry. And she said, but here's the crazy part of it, is I've forgiven him, and my family is angry with me because I've forgiven this guy,
Oh,
and now I understand maybe why he did it, and that's why I was crying. Right. So yeah, yes. I mean, normally, Catherine, you're so astute because I have to ask people, well, what would this mean for society?
yes.
But you're instantly getting what it would mean for society, and you would even see it more if you did it on yourself, if you went and got it done.
Yeah,
I
I know.
have it.
Got
Yeah,
anywhere in
and
England?
well, no, yeah, there is in Bristol. I can hook you
Is
up with a
there?
doctor. I think it's called Pain Spa, and they're doing it the right way with the dual injection on each side.
Wow.
Yeah, so I can look it up, but I know of several people that have gone and gotten it done in Bristol.
Wow. I
Okay.
mean, I think
Yeah.
it's absolutely huge because also I mean, we haven't got time to go on it today, but Jamie, I so want to have you back if we can book another one because I think there's so much more that we can cover from first and foremost, going back to your start about people always talk about it's never too late, but when you've been so brave to go back and address your story and what has happened to you, and I can't even comprehend. I've got so many more questions for you about
Well,
that.
let's do another. We could do another show
But
next week, or we anytime you want to
yeah,
do
we
it. But let me.
must do because I
Yeah,
do
but let
think
me.
for everyone watching this, the implications, everyone knows multiple people in their lives, probably most of the people watching this themselves, that are affected by this. And
I
not
asked. Yeah.
does it come out in their
I.
physical
Yeah.
health, but every
I.
aspect of their life.
I asked a famous psychiatrist one time what percentage of people walking around on psychotropic drugs merely had an issue of brain health and
Yeah,
potential or a physiological condition. These easily remediated now. And he said, and this is a guy, he was just speaking to the brain, not even the nervous system work I
yeah,
was doing. And he said 85%. But let's end this on this note, if you don't mind. And I'll come back whenever you want. I'll come back next week. We can do a part two,
brilliant.
or we were talking about doing another thing with one of your colleagues, and we could do that and then come
Yeah,
back and do this right after. But let me end with this. The reason I wrote ChildX, it was because a lot of times people ask me, like, how does someone survive that and become you?
yeah,
You know? And again, I'm not necessarily proud of it in the sense that, like, I was a twig being swept down a river and all these remarkable things happened. So I don't want to be proud of what happened to me. But I, what I explain in Child X is what I went through, which is the impossible, and
mhm,
how I what I did to come out of it. And I wrote this for as a contribution to the human, and I say this with like a humility, is like, you know, I felt like I was so far down in the deepest depths of hell. So many
yeah,
of the kids I grew up, suicides, drug addiction, I was in the deepest depths of hell, and comparatively have come back.
yeah,
Not necessarily in a Dickens way, but in a rags to respectability, maybe a Horatio Alger way. And so this book, Child X, is for everyone
yeah.
who's in a place where they think, no, it's just too much. I'm here now. And this is probably where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. I'm really hoping that Child X can be a source of even in certain cases, a roadmap of the way back from the impossible. And that's why I wrote the book, because when you sit down to write a book like that, you want to, why write it unless there's something that it can contribute that's going to be new. And that's why I wrote it. So it's for everyone. It's for everyone.
Absolutely, so important. So everyone who's watching this is really, you're all going to know people in your life that really need this book because it really is incredible. All the links about how to pre-order it are below. That's something we can all really do to shift. Everyone talks about shifting the world, I don't think anyone's happy with where we're at as humanity. And this is such an important step to do this. And when we get into future conversations, we're going to talk about our poor animal friends as well that we've completely fucked it up for. So excuse
No, yeah, that's
but
true.
you know,
Yeah.
it is true. It is really true. But you know, the great thing is now there's solutions that are proven to work, that are
We
accessible.
know more about the brain in the last 10 years
Yeah,
and the nervous system than we did in the previous 10,000.
yeah,
And it's out there now for you to take advantage of. So please, you don't have to live constantly in a state of your body and your nervous system buzzing about what's going to happen. You don't have to live like
absolutely.
that.
And
Okay.
your loved ones will thank you for it so much,
Yeah.
because we all know
Yeah.
what it's like to be living with someone in that state. And you know,
Yeah.
I recognize a lot of that myself. Jamie, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing so generously. Thank you so much. I mean, you know, all your books are absolutely fantastic. I would really encourage ChildX. The link will be to pre-order. You can actually get the Invisible Machine now. I'm halfway through it. It's incredible. I've got it on Audible. You can buy it in all sorts of different formats, of course. So the links to both of those will be below, and also to connect with Jamie on
And I also have a stunningly beautiful graphic novel coming out next year called Hybrid,
amazing.
which is a sci-fi interpretation of my story, done with the most staggering artwork you've ever seen, with my collaboration with a woman in Italy. And I'm really proud of that'll be coming out also next year. So that'll be online in the next couple of months. But so I'm working, I'm working. But
You
yeah, but
are.
Child X, obviously I care about getting the word out about trauma. And I do think that what's going to make the Invisible Machine even more successful is for people to learn my story.
Yeah,
So that is what I'm, what I want. I just feel like this book can do a lot of good. And even just understanding, it'll drive more people to the Invisible Machine, and then people will understand why so many people around them do things they can't understand. Leaders
absolutely.
to family members, to children, to spouses, to mothers, to fathers. When you take away the mental label,
Yeah,
all the stigma goes away. We don't
absolutely.
judge people for having a broken leg, Catherine. So when
Absolutely.
you truly understand that this is biological injury, you don't treat people the same way. You treat yourself better because the stigma is gone. It's so, so important. But thank you for having me. This has been an unexpected and, very, very, just a incredible conversation for me. So thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. Now, everyone watching this, please put your questions below. We've got a very exciting collaboration coming up with Jamie and a couple of other guests that you are not going to want to miss. So thank you. Any questions you want us to cover, please put below. Thank you so much, Jamie. See you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. And if you feel inspired, please do share with your friends and family. This helps us spread the word and also helps me encourage some exciting new guests to take part in this podcast. And above all, stay curious and stay free.